In animation, a dozen concentric bands in various colors and textures swirl behind the words Ability Summit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Ability Summit 2025 session on the European Accessibility Act, or EAA. My name is Jamie Dean. I am an attorney leading the accessibility regulation team here at Microsoft, and I am joined by three global experts who are going to help us unpack the EAA, what it is, how you can be ready. First, I'm going to introduce Leonie Watson. Leonie, welcome.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone.
Leonie is joining us from the United Kingdom, where she is the director of the accessible design firm Tetralogical. She specializes in data visualization accessibility and the impact of generative AI on accessibility. Another hat that Leonie wears is as chair of the board of directors for W3C. That's the organization who publishes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, one of the world's most important accessibility standards. Next up, we have Susanna Lawrence. Susanna, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Susanna is joining us from Sweden. She, like Leonie, wears multiple accessibility hats. One of those is as managing director for the Funka Foundation, which is a nonprofit focusing on disability and accessibility research. She is also the G3 ICT and International Association of Accessibility Professionals representative to the EU. And maybe most relevant for today, she is the chair of the joint technical body that is responsible for overseeing updates to European Accessibility Standards EN 301-549. We'll hear a little bit more about that later. And third, we have Ali Hurt joining us from Seattle. Hello, Ali.
Hey there, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
Ali is Microsoft's Director of Accessibility Compliance. She brings more than a decade of engineering experience to that role, including working on flagship products like Microsoft Word and Excel. In her role, she's responsible for empowering engineering teams to meet global accessibility requirements, and she has a key role in helping Microsoft be ready for the EAA. Now, relevant for this audience, Leonie, Susanna, and I each have personal experience with low vision and blindness that informs our work. And Ali, well, it's okay that you're here. You've got plenty of time in your life to join the Low Vision and Blindness Club, but we're going to accept you as you are for today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And no, it's a group that anyone can join at any time.
That's right. So the Accessibility, or the European Accessibility Act, the EAA, what is it? It's a landmark piece of legislation that's aimed at harmonizing accessibility requirements across the European Union. It regulates products, a category that includes things like consumer computers and their operating systems, smartphones, ATMs and ticketing machines, and other devices. It also covers services, a category that includes things like electronic communications, banking and finance services, and e-commerce, among others. And as of June 28, 2025, member states are going to start enforcing it. That means that after that date, again, June 28, 2025, in scope products and services need to meet EAA requirements in order to be placed on the EU market. So Leonie, Susanna, and Ali, you all know that accessibility laws really aren't anything new. Here in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act and the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. In the UK, you have the Equality Act. In Europe, you have the Web Directive. Each of those things touches on accessibility in some way. And so my first question is the EAA, in light of all these other accessibility laws, is it really a big deal? So I'll start with you, Susanna, then Leonie and Ali. Is the EAA a big deal?
Yes, I think so, because I have to talk about it every day. So for me, it's a big deal. No, but I think what makes it an ambitious legislation is that it has to do with the inner market. So no matter where the company, the manufacturer, the importer, the distributor, and so on is headquartered, if you want to sell things in the European Union, you need to comply with this legislation. But that, I think, makes it a bigger deal than maybe people think.
How about you, Leonie?
Yes, I agree. I think it definitely is a landmark piece of legislation for just the reason that Susanna just outlined. I think, though, we're going to have to wait until we see really how effective it is in terms of how easily can a consumer bring about, a case against someone who is not conforming with the legislation. Legislation around the world for all sorts of things, but especially accessibility, is really contingent on the judicial system of the region in question. In the UK, it's very, very hard to bring a legal case on grounds of digital accessibility. In America, it's arguably far too easy. The middle ground is probably somewhere in the middle, and it remains to be seen, for the time being at least, where the EAA will sit in that in terms of, the surveillance bodies that are set up within the member states.
Absolutely. Ali?
Yeah, so I think for Microsoft and many other technology providers, it does feel like a big difference, especially conceptually, but perhaps not actually in practice. Microsoft and many others are already using global standards like EN 301549 to build accessible products and services. But it does feel like a big new piece of legislation. Every new piece of legislation feels like a big deal, frankly. And one other thing I think that's unique to this is many of the existing regulations that Microsoft is subject to, it's really our customers that are obligated to procure accessible software. And so this time it's Microsoft's delivery of products and services that's directly regulated. And of course, there are some net new requirements to the EAA, things like packaging, documentation, that we need to implement as well.
So I'd say you three are fairly solidly in the big deal camp. I want to be a contrarian. Maybe it's just because I'm an attorney. So I'll be a contrarian just a little bit and say, I agree 100% with what you're saying. I do think it's a big deal. I also think it might not be a big deal depending on what type of product or service you are placing on the market. So one thing about the EAA that is unique is that it covers certain products and services, like I outlined at the outset of our session, but it doesn't cover everything. So it's a really big deal if you're in scope, maybe not as big of a deal if you're out of scope. I still think we all hope that the EAA is going to improve accessibility, even for products that it doesn't directly cover. So, Lainey, you're a little bit closer to the EU than Ali and I are, and Susanna, you're in the EU. What are you two hearing from consumers and companies and regulators as the June 28, 2025 enforcement date gets closer? Let's start with you, Lainey. What are you hearing from your clients and from others in the community about the EAA?
So from our customers, really a very typical range of approaches so far, from those who got in touch with us 18 months or so ago to start preparing, to those who are apparently only just thinking about it now, and hoping that, companies like Tetralogical, others around the world, have got time and bandwidth now to assist them to figure out what they need to do in the next 4 months. That hasn't changed, in all the pieces of legislation I've ever seen, come and go over the years. Definite interest, I think, from certain sectors, though. Publishing, people in the digital book reader, e-reader, we're certainly hearing, a lot of interest from there. Same with TV and video content. Interestingly, a lot of customers that we work with in that space have been, really keen to move forward. Conversely, though, I'm hearing very, very little from consumers at all on the subject, but that's perhaps not surprising just yet.
Yeah. How about you, Susanna? You mentioned earlier you're talking about this almost every day right now in the various roles that you have. What are you hearing from folks around the EU?
So if I may go back to what you just said before, that it's kind of restricted in scope, that is absolutely true. But in the EU and the European Commission, which I work for a lot, we usually say that it's the trickle-down effect. So we think that this will spread. And we saw that with the Web Accessibility Directive, that is only, quote unquote, for public sector websites, but all the public owned companies also are dragged into this, and then all the ICT companies that sell, so all the vendors and suppliers to public sector, which is huge in Europe. They have really a magnificent purchasing power. So everyone that wants to sell to them, they also now need to comply, not directly, but indirectly. So I think with a little luck, the EAA will also cover, indirectly more than what is on the paper. So what I hear is questions. A lot of people, like Leonie said, waking up very late, but that has always been the case. I think the bigger companies usually know about the legislation since before, so they are preparing and maybe in a good place. Whereas the small and mid-sized companies are more maybe new to this, and especially in e-commerce. I think the definition of e-commerce in the EAA is very broad, and I think there is quite a large, substantial number of economic operators that do not understand that they are in scope of this legislation. When it comes to the consumers, we hear very little. My feeling is that the end users do not know about their rights, and I think they do not know. I mean, maybe they have heard about the Accessibility Act, but I don't think they know what they are entitled to do. And it's exactly the same as with the Web Accessibility Directive, the feedback mechanism that is a very prominent part of that legislation. Enforcement of that legislation doesn't work in all parts of Europe because the end users actually they have no idea what their rights are. So I think there is a gap from the organizations in scope, but also on the consumer side.
Do you all have thoughts on what we can do to close that gap? And maybe Susanna, are there lessons learned even from the Web Directive on how we can drive greater awareness amongst consumers, but also those small and medium-sized businesses who may not have this on their radar screen?
Yeah, I think for the end users, it's easier, kind of, because we have a very strong relationship, both from my IAAP work and also in the research foundation that I lead. We have a very close collaboration with end user organizations. So we are doing research projects, we're doing studies, investigations. I know Google is also organizing things to kind of spread the word. I think that is doable, and you can do it with training. And I mean, continue talking about the EAA like we are doing. The smaller mid-sized companies, that is, I think, a little bit more tricky, because if they don't know, I mean, it's kind of the unknown. If they don't know that they are in scope, how can we reach them? That is, I haven't really figured that out yet, but I'm sure that with Microsoft's big, all your partners and clients and everything, I mean, you're in a very good position to reach plenty of people in one go. If you start communicating on this, if you could take that on, I would be more than happy. If not only you, of course, but I mean, all the really large corporations could do a very good job also in being kind of the front runners and showing that this is not a barrier. This is something, everyone can do it. It's important. It's kind of return on investment. If you see this positive and talk about it, I think that makes a big difference also for smaller companies.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we'll get a chance in a little bit to talk about maybe some ways that Microsoft's trying to do that now. But one of the themes that stands out to me, something that Ali referenced when she was talking about the EAA being a big deal, is that the EAA has much more of a proactive focus. So on the product side, products are required to actually reference the EAA in the declaration of conformity that they're required to prepare in order to offer their products in the EU. So in short, they've got to tell regulators that they're complying. And both products and services have obligations to notify regulators of non-compliance in some circumstances. So Lainey, let me come back to you for a minute. Is this kind of proactive nature of the EAA, is it something that changes the way your clients are thinking about how they deliver their products and services? And is it something that should change the way that they're thinking about how they deliver their products and services?
I think it absolutely should. By the nature of what we do, we tend to work with organizations that are already thinking about how to design and build accessibility in. So there's definitely a kind of sort of skew for the organizations we spend most of our time with, because by definition, they wouldn't have come to us if they hadn't already been kind of thinking in those terms. I do hope it'll kind of encourage other organizations to start shifting left, as the saying goes, and start looking at the whole process of producing a product or a service. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
Well, you did a great job answering it, so good on
All
you.
right,
But
I'll stop there then.
Oh, don't stop yet, because I want to ask you about something you just said. You just used the term shift left. So we hear that a lot in the in the development world, especially around accessibility. Can you just tell us what that means and maybe how that helps drive a better experience for users, but also helps drive compliance with laws like the EAA?
Yes, it's basically the idea that accessibility doesn't exist in the very last few steps before you launch a product or a service. So in web accessibility, for example, for the longest time, everybody sort of carried on as though it was all the developers that were responsible for how accessible a website was. We have long since come to understand that actually it starts way back in the requirements gathering, the user research, the creative visual design, the interaction design, long before you get to actually implementing anything at the code level. And so the idea is that the left is earlier in the process, essentially. And I think because the EAA, essentially represents that idea. I forget the phrase it used, and Susanna or Jamie, you'll definitely be able to tell me, but there's this idea about sort of maximizing for the future. And I don't think, you can do that with a product or a service unless you're really building this thinking in from the very beginning of the development of those things.
Yeah, maximizing foreseeable use, I think is the language. No, you got it. And Susanna, there's actually some standards that may help with this, right? Isn't there a standard that's being created as part of the EAA about design for all?
Yes, there is already a European standard on design for all, the 17161, and it's a procedural standard, and we are updating it, reviewing it and updating it to go with or to support the European Accessibility Act, but already now it's possible to use it it's really an approach on how to use design for all as a process, so that when you design, develop, whatever you do with your product or service, that it kind of accessibility becomes the outcome of that work. So that is a very good one way of doing it. Of course, there are many others, but I really believe in kind of having it in your day-to-day workflow. That's the only way to succeed with accessibility. If you see it as a one-off project, and then next year we do gender issues, and then the third year we do something else, that doesn't really work. So you need to kind of build it into your daily workflow. I think that's the only way to succeed with accessibility, really.
Yeah. And Ali, I know Microsoft, we talk about shift left and accessible design. Do you want to maybe explain what we think about accessible design here at Microsoft? And maybe I think we have a shout out to one of our colleagues that we can give to for some other help on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at a high level, accessibility just means creating products, built environments, services that can be used by people of all abilities and disabilities. What that actually looks like in practice, of course, depends a lot on what the experience is, who the audience is, how a service product is delivered. And that's another reason why it's so important to consider people with disabilities and inclusive design from the very beginning. And so we do have a wonderful inclusive designer here at Microsoft named Christina Mallon. I'm sure many of you have heard of her, worked with her, and she's leading another session here in the Ability Summit Build Track to talk about inclusive design and giving some tips on how you can implement those practices in your organization.
Awesome. Thank you. So it sounds like we've got some great starting points for companies that may not have deep experience with accessibility, both standards-based resource that Susanna referenced and another great session here at Ability Summit.
May I just say that if we really mean shift left, then the Microsofts and all the other companies that are creating tools should make sure that it's not possible to make something inaccessible. If everything was built in from the start, I would go on holiday forever, and Leonie could do other nice things with her life as well. And we wouldn't need to kind of build it wrong first and then remediate afterwards. We are working backwards. So large corporations and also smaller publishing system, CMS companies or whatever, if you all could come together and say, hey, it should be much more cumbersome to do something inaccessible. That's when I want to go 52 steps down in the menu to find something that is really inaccessible. But the default situation should be that it just becomes accessible. Then we would all be much happier, I think.
Yes.
A lot of people
agree.
would be out of work, but I mean, I would happily do something else if that was the case.
Yep.
Yep.
I will also
love that.
happily be out of work if we solve that problem, for the record. So,
Oh my goodness. Okay, we can't take over Christina's session. We got to get back to the EAA.
Sorry.
So no, I love it. It's such a great point. And I'm going to stick with you for a second, Susanna. And one of the distinct features of the EAA, at least as compared to the web directive, is the way that it will be enforced. And I know we've already referenced enforcement a couple times today, and the importance of enforcement as a way to really make the act have its maximum impact. Can you talk, Susanna, just about how the EAA will be enforced and the surveillance process that it describes?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really very kind of close to the market. So the inner market is always very important as a driver for the EU. And I'm sometimes jokingly, sometimes not jokingly saying that we are doing this to be able to compete with the US. I think we still are not doing that really, but that's always how the politicians talk about it. And so in every member state, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10 maybe surveillance authorities that will have the responsibility to monitor how this implementation goes for this legislation. And they will both kind of do market surveillance as they usually do. The idea to make it sector-wise is, of course, that they already have a good understanding about their specific sector, whether they're being banking or products or something else, and then they can just kind of add accessibility into what they are already doing, and that would be an easier way and kind of closer to the economic operator. So I think that is something clever in that. The problem may be that in some, especially in the smaller member states, it's a problem with having experts enough, because we already had in the Web Accessibility Directive, there's one monitoring agency in each member state, except for the federal ones where we have several, but and in some countries they have also problems already having enough boots on the ground to do this testing. So that is a challenge, but I think it really makes sense that the surveillance is done kind of as close as possible to those market operators. And they will both do surveillance and also handle complaints. So the first round of complaints from users before you go to court. And I really hope that most of the issues will be handled with the surveillance authority, and not so that we don't end up in a litigation process. That doesn't really fit how Europeans work. And I love the US for many perspectives, but that part of how you do accessibility is not to my liking. So I hope we won't end up in that corner. But let's see what happens. It will be, I think, as always, some of the smaller member states, maybe the less mature member states when it comes to accessibility, will struggle more, and some will be the front runners. And they usually have a good coordination and help each other out. So I think in a couple of months' time, after June, we will see much more clarity on how this is working, hopefully.
I think that's one of the strong points about the EAA and the Web Accessibility Directive before it. It's the idea that the monitoring bodies, or in this case, surveillance bodies, can effectively champion the case. So it's actually really those bodies that can take the lead on working with organizations that are not complying with the legislation. It doesn't fall necessarily on an individual consumer to feel they've got to take the burden of making their case. I think that's a really nice idea about both those bits of legislation.
And I think
and when it works best, it's not only policing, but more the firefighters. So actually also supporting and helping and providing training and facilitating and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's a great analogy. I love that. And I also think it gives opportunities for collaboration. Susanna, you just mentioned that we really are still looking for clarity. And, one of the things that concerns me is when you have so many regulators, there's maybe potential for that many more differing interpretations, especially if some of those regulators don't have deep experience. So what I hope this also means is opportunities to collaborate between regulators and industry and consumers to come up with interpretations that make sense and to really make the act as impactful as we all want it to be. So speaking of clarity, one of the things that you can't get very far into the EAA without seeing is references to EN 301-549, which is an accessibility standard. And Susanna, you've got a lot to do with overseeing the work to update EN 301-549. But I don't presume that everybody who's watching our session today is deeply familiar with it. So can you explain first, what is a standard, and then what is EN 301-549 specifically?
So in this context, a standard is a document where different stakeholders get together and say, okay, let's do this together and let's do it in the same way because it will benefit us all. So for example, when standards do not work is when, or when standards are lacking is when I go abroad and I need to have my handbag full of electronic things to make sure that I can get electricity in the UK or in US, and not only what we have in most of the EU countries. So we have a standard, but it's not global. That's stupid, because that means that it's more expensive for economic operators and it's also more cumbersome for me. So if we have the same standard, it becomes better for consumers and better for the economic operators. Everyone gains if we have standards. And so many things in life in our everyday life is really standardized. The height of tables and chairs and doors. And I mean, there's so many standards everywhere. People just don't understand how much is really standardized. It's also the definition of standardization work it's a sure way to lose friends and put family asleep, which is because it's very, very time consuming and it's perceived as very, very boring. And I remember when I started doing this, I'm a kind of a dinosaur in this. When I started, I was always the only female. That has changed. So it is going better, but we really lack people that are younger than almost retired. So if anyone is young listening to this, please do standards. it's really important. And in accessibility, the alternative to standard would be that every time Microsoft or anyone else would produce something, you would need to do 1 million user tests, because we have all these different disabilities with all the assistive technologies, with all the competence and the combination of browsers and operating systems and everything. It's just undoable. We would get nothing done. So we need to have a common minimum requirement that says, okay, this is how it's supposed to work for screen readers, so that everyone that is producing screen readers can just follow this standard. That's kind of the basic understanding. So it's not making things perfect, but it's making it equally bad for everyone. That doesn't sound fantastic, but at least it's democratic. So in the EU, when we have a legislation, so we have regulations and directives, but all the laws on accessibility are directives. That means that they are common from the EU standpoint, but they are implemented, transposed is the fancy word, into the national legislation. So we have a common ground, but there's a little bit of flexibility among the member states to just make sure that the law fits with their tradition and history and other legal framework, that makes total sense. And in the law, it says who is covered and what is covered. But if you need more technical specifications on the actual how, then we provide voluntary standards. So the standards is a way to support everyone that would like to comply with the legislation on a how. If you follow the standard and work with the standard, then you are fairly sure that you cannot be sued and that everything is fine and that you're meeting the requirements of the legislation. But you are also entitled to do it in another way. That way we open up for innovation. And also, even if standards are very, very slow, legislation is an even slower process. So this way we can have the law is fixed and the standard can still move. So we are updating the standard. So we don't end up in a situation like in the US where you still point to WCAG 2.0, which is a very old standard. So we move the standards, or that way the standards, they will always be a little bit after or quite a bit after the technological development, but still they are trying to keep up a little bit. So when the Commission is deciding on a legislation, they are asking the standardization bodies in Europe to come up with standards to act as presumed conformance. That means that those standards are not just industry papers that somebody came up with, but it's actually they are put into kind of a legal process, and they are then validated by the Commission, and they are published in something called the official journal. And when they are published in the official journal, they become harmonized standards that act as presumed conformance. That means that you can use them to support your legislation work. With the EAA, the 3 European standardization bodies have been tasked with updating 3 existing standards and developing 3 new standards, and also updating a technical report. So there are 7 documents that are either updated or developed from scratch to support everyone that would like to comply with this, or who needs to comply with this legislation, I should say.
I want to reflect back one of the things that you just said to make sure that our audience has a chance to really digest it. So EN 301-549 is a standard that once it's harmonized can be used to show presumed conformance. In other words, you could say, I am conforming to the relevant sections of the EAA by meeting EN 301-549, right?
Yes. The EN 301-549 is a very broad standard. It covers kind of all ICT. I shouldn't say that because it's probably not all, but it's hardware, software, web. There's a lot of things in it. So it has annexes to say, okay, this annex, they will change their names in the review, but the annex is for the Web Accessibility Directive. There will be another annex for the European Accessibility Act. So it's not conforming with the whole standard, it's conforming with the relevant parts of the EN. And the EN is a European standard, but it's nowadays used also in Canada, in Mexico, in Kenya, in Australia, and so on. So it's kind of making its way throughout the world slowly, but still. So it's used also outside of the EU.
So, Lanny, one of the things that Susanna has just described for us is the option of using the standard, but the flexibility of conforming with the EAA by means outside of the standard. Are there some challenges to that flexibility?
I suspect there are, yes. One is how the surveillance bodies will handle an organization that has chosen some completely, original, different, standard to prove its conformity. To be honest, though, I doubt this is going to happen. I really can't imagine that probably any organization is likely to do that. They're far more likely to adopt the existing standards, partly because, if they're consulting with companies like mine, we're familiar with the different existing legislations and standards, where we wouldn't be with something more customized. So I think that just sort of common body of knowledge will hold good in this case. I do understand and agree with the idea that Susanna just described of not having the legislation absolutely tied to a fixed standard, so letting the standards continue to evolve, and try to keep pace with technology, which, as we know, does change very fast. I do worry somewhat, though, that the trade-off there is kind of more uncertainty about what exactly it is that an organization needs to do. And we're certainly hearing that from a lot of our clients, is keenness to comply with this, but real uncertainty as to give me the coloring by numbers version of what I need to do to make my product or my service conform with the EAA. I'm not sure there's a good solution to that other than just getting to grips with how it all works and hangs together, but it is a concern.
Yeah. And the standardization or the harmonization process that Susanna described, one of the pieces that gets spoken about frequently with the EAA is that harmonization won't be done before June 28, 2025. So we won't have an EAA harmonized standard by the date that member states will begin enforcing the EAA. So, Lanny, in that context, what in general are you telling the folks you work with to help them be ready for June 28? Did they get a free pass since harmonization isn't done, or are you telling them to do some things in the meantime?
No, I mean, our philosophy has always been to encourage organizations to go for the highest, most recent standard that they possibly can. So, for example, at the time WCAG 2.2 was released, once it became stable enough that we knew with reasonable certainty what it was going to look like, we'd already begun to encourage our clients to start moving towards it, just because our general feeling is that the more recent the standard, the more thought that's gone into it, the better experience you're going to get by meeting it. And it's exactly the same in this case. We're encouraging our customers to use the current version of EN 301549, but we also know that an update is coming, something Susanna knows far more about than I do. So even if we don't know yet if it's stable enough to rely on as actually go ahead and adopt what will become the new standard, we're certainly encouraging people to start thinking in that direction whilst using the existing version of it.
Yeah. How about you, Susanna? I know you've heard this before, that the standards, quote unquote, won't be ready. That's the language that we hear a lot. What are you telling folks to do in this period between June 28, 2025 and the time when one or more standards are harmonized for the EAA?
Well, first of all, they can always blame me, so that's good. I mean, you should always have somebody to blame. But in reality, I think we are. I really understand that it would have been much better if they were ready on time. Absolutely. So, but I don't think that we are in complete ignorance of everything. It's not like the reviewed EN 301549 will be a completely new standard that will invent new rules for accessibility. That's not what is happening. Right. I mean, the really big things that are new, it's in support services and in packaging, because there we didn't have European standards before. The EN 301549 is updated, and it will incorporate, of course, WCAG 2.2 when it comes to the web things. So that is kind of, everything is fine there. And then we're refining things that are new to EAA that we didn't have earlier. So I think it's very good, a recommendation that Leonie said, but also I would really encourage people to read the Act, because even if it doesn't say exactly what you are going to do, all the requirements are really in the Annex 1 of the Accessibility Act. And the essence of the whole legislation is providing an alternative. That is, I mean, and that is what everything that is within EN 301549 is also provide an alternative. It's just, it's not, I mean, that's where you should start, and then you can, dig backwards from there. And I don't think anyone, I mean, there are small nitty-gritty details that we will absolutely refine and that will come afterwards, and I agree it's a problem, but it's not like you can't do anything because the standards are not there. That's simply not true, and especially not if you are a little bit new to this. Then there is meat enough in the existing standards and the existing versions to keep you going for a long time. So yes. I would start there and try to work with the processes. How do you test things? Do you have the right competence? Does your staff have training enough? I mean, there's a lot of things you can look at internally that are also important. All the customer services, how do your customer support services, how do they speak? Do they know how to behave if there is a person who is blind who is asking for something? I mean, you can train them in all these things long before you know the actual technical specifications.
Yeah.
Ali, I want to jump over to you because you are boots on the ground at Microsoft helping drive our EAA readiness process. Can you tell us about some of the work streams that you were a part of to make us EAA ready?
Yes, absolutely. There have been a few. One of the more interesting ones is we're applying a declaration of conformity to the Windows operating system for the first time, which, as far as I know, is the first time we've had to determine how to do that for a piece of software rather than a piece of hardware. Another one has just been kind of like you alluded to earlier, Jamie, trying to hear what everyone out in the industry and over in the EU is hearing and more importantly saying about the European Accessibility Act. There's a lot of confusion between some of the other directives in the EU right now. There, even things that don't necessarily obviously touch on accessibility, things like sustainability directives and AI directives. And we are paying attention to all the different webinars, all the different speaking engagements that folks like you, Susanna and Leonie, are speaking to the public, and we're wanting to be part of those conversations as well, mostly as a listener, but sometimes as a presenter as well. And then one big one that I'm driving is just general awareness of the European Accessibility Act. Microsoft has many, many engineers, many, many designers, government affairs folks, and they're all asked to do many things every day. Not only accessibility, but security, privacy, responsible AI, and the list goes on. So again, with every new legislation that comes to Microsoft, part of it is figuring out what our obligations are, what our requirements are, and then just driving awareness across the company so that people are ultimately doing the right thing in their day-to-day roles. Sending out newsletters, getting included in training. One of the more fun things is we've been creating kind of some swag, EAA swag. I'm holding up a mug that says "Get Ready," but instead of ready being spelled READY, it's REAADY. So we have lots of fun puns with the letters EAA, and my hope is that some of this will make it stick with people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely the most fun part of it, because it's also hours and hours of labor of really digging into the act. The scoping is a huge issue that's been talked about a couple of times, just determining whether we are in scope. And then you've got the whole requirements interpretation piece. And these things aren't easy. I think it's one thing to read them and understand the intent, but then people like you, Ali, have to really roll up your sleeves and work with engineers to say, well, what does this mean for this one specific feature of one specific application? So it is a big lift to be ready for the act. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to spend some time asking each of you to look into the future. In two ways, really. So the first thing I am wondering is, we said a few times, if you haven't heard this so far, get your pen and paper ready and take down a note. As of June 28, 2025, member states will start enforcing the EAA. So panelists, what do we think life is going to look like on June 29 of 2025, a day into the EAA? Let's start with you, Lenny. Do you think the world's going to stop turning or anything?
No, I imagine there will be a lot of sitting around drinking cups of tea and generally ignoring the EAA on the 29th. These things don't move quickly, as Susanna's mentioned, you've mentioned already. It's going to take months, if not longer, before we really start to see the material impact of this as a piece of legislation. Having said that, what we might see more quickly is a kind of softer impact. Flips more around to my kind of perspective as a consumer with a disability is I'm really looking forward to starting to see particularly things like more accessible packaging coming my way. And so that's actually my real optimism for this, is that actually those of us on the receiving end of all these products and services will start to notice the impact probably more quickly than we will do at a kind of legislative, legal kind of scale.
Yeah. Susanna, what do you think life will look like on June 29?
I hope that a small revolution will happen when it comes to end users that will start exercising their rights, and consumers that will start complaining about things, and people actually, if we have managed to make people aware, that they will actually start using this legislation. And also, of course, the whole accessibility community, the experts and everything. I think everyone has some idea of what they are going to do. People do kind of large audits or monitoring, and they're doing PR and marketing and everything. So I think everyone in their own way will start kind of using the EAA, and the potential that Leonie is right, that people didn't magically change everything to the 29th. There is a potential that she's right, that everything is not perfect. So then I hope that we will all try to, make even more buzz around it, so that we will, stepwise improve into the future.
All right. In about 15 seconds each, if we reconvene this panel in 5 years, what do you hope the EAA will have accomplished? Ali, let's start with you.
Yeah, so what I hope is exactly what Susanna called out earlier, the trickle-down effect. So I hope that the proactive nature of EAA requirements has expanded the use of accessible design and making sure that everything is accessible by default, which will lead to more usable experiences for all.
Susanna, how about you?
I hope that more companies around the globe has realized that what is really the essence of the EAA, which is what Leonie said, maximizing the foreseeable use, that this is a business opportunity and that you can earn more money, sell more products, have more satisfied customers if you do accessibility. That if we have more economic operators understanding this and realizing, okay, this wasn't just somebody evil in the commission telling us to do something that was super boring. This made sense, and we are now providing better products and services. That is what I'm hoping for 5 years from now.
Leonie, you already gave us one talking about packaging and support. Do you have anything else that you hope the EAA will accomplish?
I do. We've used the phrase trickle down. I guess I could phrase it more as trickle out. The idea being that organizations won't choose one process, one set of design build requirements just for the products and services they're distributing within the European Union. It makes logical sense to use the same processes no matter where you're selling your products and services. And so I hope we'll see a kind of sideways spread, if you like, of the good things that the EAA represents out to other markets around the world.
Wonderful. Well, we've got to leave it there because we are running out of time, but thank you so much to our panel for their insights and expertise. Thank you so much to all of you who have tuned in to this session. I hope you'll be able to use this information to drive EAA readiness in your own organization. Enjoy the rest of your Ability Summit. Bye for now.
They smile. In animation, colorful, undulating bands frame the words, "Thank you for participating, and there's more to explore." Discover other resources in the top navigation bar.